Hello everyone. I hope you're having a beautiful day. Today we're diving into a brutal twist. After publicly branding Diep a toxic influence and cutting James off, his powerful father thinks he's won, until a secret insider from his own company messages Diep, claiming she's not the only victim and asking to meet in a hidden tea shop by the river. Is it a trap or the key to exposing everything? If this story pulls you in, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. James placed the envelope in the center of his father's desk, like he was setting down a live bomb. The office was too quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows behind Mr. Thon framed the city like a conquered kingdom, glass and metal reflecting a man who believed nothing could touch him. The only sounds were the air conditioner and the faint ticking of an expensive clock. Diep stood beside James, back straight, hands folded so tightly around her own folder that her knuckles were white. She wasn't here as a scared girl from the market anymore. She was here as someone who had seen the strings being pulled and decided not to bow. James's father didn't pick up the envelope at first. He just stared at it, then at them with a cool, almost amused expression. "What is this?" he asked. "A legal notice," James answered, voice steady. "We've made copies of the hospital contract, the internal memo, the market paperwork. A lawyer's reviewed them. We're asking your company to convert the assistance into a clean grant with no personal conditions, and to stop interfering in Diep's business and our relationship." For the first time, something shifted in his father's eyes. Not fear, annoyance. A fly had dared to land on his plate. "You brought a lawyer into this?" he said slowly. "Into family matters? You brought your company into my life first," Diep replied, surprising even herself with how calm she sounded. "We're just matching the level of seriousness." He finally picked up the envelope, slid the papers out, and skimmed them, his mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You think paper will protect you from consequences?" he asked quietly. "I write the paper, James. I pay the people who interpret it." "This one wasn't written by you," James said. "And she doesn't work for you." His father's gaze flicked to Diep. "You've poisoned him well," he remarked. "I underestimated you." "No," she said. "You underestimated what happens when you push someone too far." He laughed once, a short, humorless sound, then neatly tore the legal notice in half. The ripping noise was small, but felt enormous in the room. "There," he said, dropping the halves in his trash bin. "That's what your notice is worth to me." Diep's stomach lurched, but she didn't move. James's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You know tearing that doesn't make the original disappear," James said, trying to keep his temper on a leash. "We have copies. We have witnesses. We have your memo." "Ah, yes, the memo," his father said, leaning back. "The little draft someone forgot to shred. You're not the only ones who know how to go through trash, you know." A cold weight dropped into Diep's chest. "What do you mean?" He opened a drawer and pulled out another piece of paper. The same memo, this time with red ink scrawled across it. "Revoked draft. Do not circulate." Underneath, in his own handwriting, revised for clarity. "Do you really think a judge will take that seriously?" he asked mildly. "A discarded draft? I can say it was an overzealous manager, an error. I've already prepared a clean version that makes everything look kinder." James's jaw clenched. "So you're already covering your tracks." "I'm correcting sloppy work," his father said. "Your little kitchen table revolution doesn't scare me. You want a war of documents? I've been fighting those longer than you've been alive." Diep stepped forward. "We don't want a war," she said quietly. "We want you to stop using people's fear as a tool, to stop treating my mother's heart as a line item and my life as a mistake your son has to erase." For just a heartbeat, his expression flickered, annoyance mixing with something else. Then it hardened. "You two still don't understand," he replied. "This isn't about emotion. This is about legacy. I built something out of nothing. My name means something. I will not watch my only son throw it away on a woman whose entire niche can be destroyed by a phone call." "And yet," James said, voice shaking now, not with fear but fury, "that woman is the only one who's ever called me more than your legacy." His father's eyes narrowed. "Is that why you brought her here? To perform her strength in front of me? To make me respect her?" "No," Diep cut in. "We're done trying to make you respect me. We're here to tell you we see you, clearly." She tapped the desk lightly. "We know about the calls to the market, the cafe, the suppliers. We know how you tied the hospital money to whether James obeys. We know you're already editing the story. You can fix your memos. You can shred papers. But you can't unring the bell. People have talked." James's father stood slowly, palms flat on the desk, leaning forward. "You think a few frightened shopkeepers and a cousin lawyer can hurt me?" he asked, voice low. "You think the world cares about your little drama? If this goes public, do you know what people will say? That I'm a dedicated father trying to keep my son from ruining his future. That I was generous to your sick mother. You will be painted as the ungrateful ones." "That's exactly what Huang said you'd do," James shot back. "Turn this into a morality play where you're the martyr and we're villains for daring to want a life you don't control." His father blinked at the name. "You hired Huang?" he asked, surprised despite himself. "She's not cheap." "We didn't hire her," Diep said. "She offered us a discount. She said men like you are why she went to law school." For the first time, a real crack showed in his composure. "You've chosen your side then," he said to James. "You've chosen this life, this woman, this chaos." James nodded, eyes steady even as they glossed. "I've chosen what feels honest," he said. "You can keep the rest." His father inhaled slowly, like a man tasting a bitter medicine. "Fine," he said at last. "If you walk out of here with her, you walk out without my name, no job, no shares, no safety net. And I will reclassify the hospital assistants tomorrow. Let the courts decide who owes what. Let your girlfriend explain to her family why their bills turned into a lawsuit." Diep felt the room tilt. That was the line. The threat fully voiced. James's voice softened, but there was steel in it. "If you do that," he said, "you're telling the whole world what kind of man you are. Not a protector, a blackmailer using a woman's surgery to punish his son. You really think that's the legacy you want?" His father leaned back, eyes cold. "Legacies are written by the winners," he said, "not the sentimental." The silence that followed was so thick Diep could hear her own pulse. Finally, she straightened. "We're done here," she said quietly. "You've made your position clear. So have we." James hesitated only a second, then took her hand. Together, they walked out of the office without looking back. When the door clicked shut, his father exhaled sharply, then picked up his phone. "Prepare the reclassification paperwork," he told someone on the other end, "and draft a statement about an employee leaving due to personal issues that conflict with our values. Make sure it sounds sympathetic, and find out which staff have been talking to them." "War," declared in smooth phrases and quiet commands. Down on the street, the sunlight was almost too bright. James squinted, then laughed suddenly. A sharp, shaky sound that made Diep jump. "What?" she asked. "I just realized," he said. "I walked in there afraid of losing everything. But the things I was afraid of losing, they were already broken. The job, the name, him." She stared at him. "You don't regret what you said?" "Do you?" he asked. Her throat tightened. Not one word. He nodded, letting out a long breath. "Just then we deal with the rest." Almost as if on cue, his phone buzzed. A message from HR. Notice of termination, voluntary departure. He snorted. "Fast," he said. He couldn't wait. "Let him be fast," Diep replied. "We'll be patient." On the bus home, Nee's voice messages popped up one after another. Little audio bubbles of life. At the hospital with Grandma, singing a new song she learned. Asking if Uncle James and Ms. Diep were winning their mission. Diep played one, and they both smiled despite everything. The contrast was almost painful. That tiny, hopeful voice against the heavy reality of legal threats and cut-off funds. "Do we tell her?" James asked softly. "About losing my job?" "We tell her we're changing jobs," Diep said. "From being controlled to being stubborn." She nudged him lightly with her shoulder. "Kids understand more than we think, but they don't need all the details." At home, Aunt Hoa was waiting with steaming bowls of noodle soup and a look that said she already knew more than they'd told her. "Well?" she demanded, hands on hips. "Did the king decree exile or execution?" "Both," James said dryly, sliding into a chair. "Apparently we're dead to his company." "Good," she said, without missing a beat. "Now you can stop pretending the crown wasn't choking you." Diep burst into surprised laughter. It broke the tension like a dropped plate that somehow lands intact. As they ate, they talked through Huang's next steps. A formal response to the termination, a preemptive letter to the hospital, noting that any sudden reclassification of the assistants after a family dispute would be interesting to examine. "If he moves too aggressively," Huang had said on the phone, "he looks vindictive. Men like him hate that. Their whole power rests on looking respectable while doing questionable things." "But what if he doesn't care?" Diep had asked. "Then he'll overplay his hand," Huang replied. "And we'll be waiting." That night, when Nee finally fell asleep tangled between them like a little bridge, James lay staring at the cracked ceiling. "Are you scared?" Diep whispered into the darkness. "Terrified," he admitted. "Rent, bills, your mother's follow-up care. Finding work without my father's shadow either blocking me or hanging over me." "And?" she pressed. "And weirdly relieved," he said. "It's like, for the first time, the fear is honest. Not that he'll be angry, but that life will be hard. I can live with hard. I'm done living with dishonest." She smiled into the dark. "That sounds like a good niche for you," she murmured. "Honest, even when it hurts." He laughed quietly. "You and your niches." They drifted in and out of sleep, hearts still half awake. Sometime near dawn, a notification slid onto James's phone. He saw it bleary-eyed when he reached for water. Headline from a local business blog. "Respected CEO cuts ties with toxic influence. Chooses company over son's personal drama." Under it, a photo taken from some distance. Him and Diep leaving the office hand in hand. He woke fully then, reading the article, carefully worded, full of anonymous sources talking about how worried Mr. Than was for his confused son. His pulse spiked. He handed the phone to Diep. "So it begins," she said quietly, eyes scanning the screen. "He's writing the public version." She looked up at him, a new steadiness in her gaze. "Then we'll write ours," she said. "Not today, not out of anger, but soon, with our own witnesses, our own words." James nodded slowly. The war between them and his father's world had just stepped out of private offices and into the public eye. Would that exposure finally force the older man to reveal his full cruelty? Or would it cost them more than they could afford? The only thing certain was this: they were no longer just surviving his decisions. They were, little by little, starting to make their own. The headline reached the hospital before they did. When Diep walked into her mother's room that morning, she found two nurses huddled over a phone, whispering. They straightened quickly, smiles too bright. "Morning, Miss Lai," one of them chirped. "Your mom's numbers look good. She might move to the regular ward tomorrow." Diep smiled back, automatic. "That's wonderful." Her mother was awake, propped up against pillows, IV line taped neatly to her hand. She looked stronger than yesterday, color back in her cheeks, eyes clear, but there was a crease between her brows that hadn't been there before. "Sit," her mother said, patting the bed. "I saw something." Diep sat. James hovered near the door, unsure whether to come in or stay out of the blast radius of whatever this was. Her mother pulled her own phone from under the blanket. On the screen, the article glared back at them. "Respected CEO cuts ties with toxic influence, chooses company over son's personal drama." Below, that photo of them leaving the office. Someone had circled Diep in red. "They're talking about you," her mother said quietly. "About us, about him." She nodded toward James. Diep's stomach twisted. "Mom, it's just—" "Red," her mother interrupted gently. The article was everything Huang had predicted. Anonymous sources close to the family said Mr. Than was heartbroken that his son had been led astray by an unstable relationship. They painted James as confused, overly emotional. They described Diep as a young woman with financial difficulties, a dependent child, and a history of business trouble. Not one word about why she'd had trouble, not one word about who'd caused it. The worst part wasn't the lies. It was the parts that were technically true, but slanted. Yes, she had money problems, a child to care for, a mother recovering from surgery. That's what made her dangerous in this story. Too much need, too much heart. James's face flushed as he read. "He made me sound like a wayward teenager," he muttered. "Like you're some gold digger." Her mother watched them, taking it all in. "Is any of this true?" she asked simply. "Some facts," Diep said, throat tight. "Most of the meaning is twisted." Her mother exhaled slowly. "I told you before," she murmured. "People like that write the story until someone takes the pen away." She reached for Diep's hand. "You can't run from this, child. If you shrink, the story grows bigger than you. If you stand, at least the truth has a face." Diep nodded, swallowing back tears. "Standing is scary." Her mother squeezed her fingers. "So is lying on this bed," she said. "But I'm still here." James stepped closer to the bed. "I won't let him use your surgery to shame her," he said, "or to make you feel grateful for something he turned into a weapon." Her mother's eyes softened. "Gratefulness is between me and God," she said, "not between me and your father." Outside in the corridor, Huang was waiting with a coffee and a printout of the same article. "I see he's chosen the sad, misunderstood father angle," she said dryly. "Predictable." "Can he sue us if we answer publicly?" Diep asked. Not if you stick to what you can prove, Huang replied. You don't have to reveal everything at once. Just ask questions in the right places. Plant doubt in his version. Let people feel something is off. Like what? James asked. Like pointing out how strange it is that a man who supposedly cared so much about a woman's sick mother tied her surgical bill to his son's love life, Huang said. Or that multiple small businesses all coincidentally stopped working with the same woman right after he became involved. You don't have to accuse, just describe. That still puts a target on their backs, Diep worried. The market manager, the cafe owner, which is why we don't name them yet, Huang said. We protect them until they're ready. For now, we focus on you, your story, your voice. If this becomes a rich CEO versus fragile girl story, he wins. If it becomes rich CEO versus calm, reasonable, exhausted but dignified woman who just wants to live, people start to ask different questions. Diep almost laughed. Exhausted but dignified should be my niche. Huang smiled faintly. It's a popular niche for women in this city, she said. Also the most underestimated. While grown-ups argued about reputations, the war quietly reached the classroom. That afternoon, when Diep picked Nui up from school, the teacher's smile was brittle. Can we talk for a moment? She asked, flipping through papers she didn't really need. Diep's stomach sank. Of course. In the playground today, the teacher began carefully. Some of the children repeated things they heard at home. About knees, family. Parents see headlines, they talk, children listen. You know how it is. What did they say? Diep asked, voice cool. The teacher hesitated. That her uncle is bad now. That her aunt stole him from his family. Kids called her trouble and the girl from the phone. She cried. I separated them, but... Diep closed her eyes for a second. Thank you for telling me, she said. I'll talk to her. In the corner of the schoolyard, Ni kicked at a small stone, face stormy. They say we're bad people, she blurted the moment she saw Diep. They say Uncle James's father is on TV and we're making him sad. Am I making him sad, Miss Diep? The question hit harder than any article. Diep knelt, taking her shoulders. Listen, she said, choosing her words like stepping stones above water. Sometimes grown-ups do wrong things and then tell a story that makes them look right. That doesn't mean you're wrong or bad. But they said... Ni's lip quivered. What if Uncle James goes away because they're mad? Diep's heart broke a little more. If he goes anywhere, she whispered, it won't be because you are bad, or because I am. It will be because some people don't know how to love without controlling. That's their problem, not yours. Are we still a family? Ni asked, voice very small. Yes, Diep said, pulling her into a hug. We are still a family. She wished fiercely that love alone could pay bills and erase contracts. Life slid into a strange rhythm. By day, James sent out resumes. At first, he got polite interviews. Those dried up quickly after the article spread. HR officers would smile, nod, then mention they'd heard things about his recent departure that made them hesitate. I can do the work, he insisted to one, more tired than angry now. I'm sure you can, the man replied, eyes kind but distant. But bringing you in means inviting your father's attention. For a small firm like ours, that's risky. By evening, James helped with homework, washed dishes, soaked his bruised knuckles in warm water. The small domestic tasks steadied him in a way no corporate meeting ever had. Welcome to the Anai Corporation, Aunt Hoa joked one night. handing him a basket of laundry. "We pay in gratitude and leftover soup." "More honest than my last job," he replied, and they all laughed, even as anxiety hummed under the humor. Diep quietly reopened her niche in a different way. No market stall, no big sign. Just boxes of cakes on the table, photos on her old phone, word of mouth. Her first few orders came from people who had whispered, "I'm sorry," at the market. A cafe on the next street over. A neighbor whose sister worked in an office where everyone was tired of overpriced snacks. "Maybe this is how we grow now," she told James, piping sesame onto a fresh batch of banana cakes. Slow, quiet, in kitchens instead of stalls. "Small roots are harder to pull up," he said, licking sugar from his thumb. There were moments like this, light, ordinary, sweet, that made it easy to forget there was a larger storm swirling just beyond their building. But the storm wasn't done with them. One evening, as Diep was putting away cooled cakes and James was helping Nye with her spelling, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She almost ignored it. Then she saw the message preview. "I work at his company. I've seen things. You're not the only ones he's hurt." Her heart skipped. "James," she said, showing him the screen. He frowned, wiped his hands, and read. A second message came in. "I can't talk long. They track everything. But what he did to you, he's done to others. Employees pushed out after getting sick. Partners ruined when they asked too many questions. If you go to court alone, he'll crush you. If you go to the press with all our stories together." The message ended abruptly. 3 dots flickered, vanished, flickered again. Then, "Meet me tomorrow. 4 p.m. Old tea shop near the river. Don't bring anyone from the company, and turn off your phones before you come." Diep and James stared at each other. "It could be a trap," he said. "It could be a chance," she replied. "Or both." They sat in silence on the worn sofa, Nye humming to herself in the next room, doodling hearts around their 3 names on a scrap of paper. "This was never just about us," Diep said slowly. "We thought we were the only targets. Maybe we're just the ones who refused to go quietly." James rubbed his face. "If we meet this person and they're telling the truth, we're not dealing with one man's temper," he said. "We're dealing with a system he built, a pattern. And patterns," Huang had told them earlier, "are what judges, journalists, and boards start paying attention to when they're tired of pretending not to see." "You don't have to do this," James said now. "We could stay small, bake, find a job under a different name. Let time bury this." "Could you live with that?" she asked gently. He thought about his mother's words in the hospital, about the reflection he wanted to see when he was old, about Nee's prayer that all the angry grown-up stuff go away. "No," he admitted. "I'd always look over my shoulder." "Then we go," Diep said. "Together, we listen, we decide after." He studied her face, the fatigue, the stubbornness, the quiet fire. "You know," he murmured, "my father thinks strength looks like never bending. I'm starting to think it looks like this instead. 2 exhausted people choosing one more hard thing." She smiled, eyes shimmering. "Welcome to my niche," she said. "We specialize in stubborn love and questionable decisions." They laughed softly, the sound a small rebellion against the fear trying to settle in their bones. Tomorrow, at 4, in a little tea shop by the river, someone who knew the inside of his father's empire would either crack the story wide open or tighten the net in ways they couldn't yet see. Would they walk into a trap? Or would they finally find the allies they needed to bring the truth fully into the light? For now, The message sat on her phone like a door half open, and sleep felt very far away. After James and Lie to Diep bravely deliver a legal notice to his powerful father, he tears it up, threatens to reclassify her mother's surgery as debt, and starts a PR war. An article circulates online painting Diep as a toxic influence, and James as a confused son led astray. Even Nai is bullied at school as gossip spreads. With lawyer Huang's help, they begin quietly building their own case, gathering proof of how his father sabotaged Diep's niche, pressured the market, and weaponized assistance. James loses job opportunities as companies fear his father, while Diep slowly restarts her baking business from home. Just when it seems like the power imbalance is too big, a mysterious insider from the company texts Diep. She's not the only victim. They ask to meet in a hidden tea shop by the river, leaving the question hanging: trap or turning point?